Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Ruy Lopez, beginning with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight of 3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Ruy Lopez, and we're going to be actually getting to the closed Ruy Lopez through the Berlin move order, beginning with knight f6, castles kingside, a6, bishop a4, bishop e7, and as you can see now we're in the closed Ruy Lopez, but it started out as a Berlin. This is actually one possible transposition. Now we're going to have b5, bishop to b3, castles kingside, and we're going to have the threat of a Marshal variation, which means, of course, that white is naturally going to have to play the Anti Marshal, and that's going to be the main focus of this video. Of course, white can't allow the Marshal because the Marshal has basically been analyzed to perpetual, and we can't allow a perpetual. So here, the main Anti Marshal that we're going to be taking a look at is this move pawn to a4. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. Now, the thing with pawn to a4 is we can't talk about this move without talking about one of the most recent World Championship matches that we just had, mainly the World Championship match between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen played in 2021, where this move was essayed several times without success by Ian Nepomniachtchi, and he was unable to break through and get a win with the white pieces. So we have to talk about the current state of the theory with this move pawn to a4, and we also have to talk about why Nepomniachtchi repeatedly played pawn to a4 throughout this match. Why didn't he try something else? Well, he did. He started the match by playing the very popular so-called ambidextrous system, beginning with the move h3. And then Magnus Carlsen played what is basically a novelty at the absolute highest levels. He played this move knight to a5, essentially offering the pawn on e5 for seemingly not enough compensation, which Nepomniachtchi, of course, accepted. And then Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi both just whipped out a ton of moves that looked a lot like home preparation. Basically, they'd figured out all these moves with their computers and their seconds at home. So the game kind of continued. Knight takes b3, getting the bishop pair for that pawn. A takes b3, bishop b7, gaining that tempo. d3, and then here's Carlsen's idea was to play pawn to d5 and get kind of this Marshall-esque kind of counterplay in the middle of the board by playing d5 and then queen d5. Now here the next couple moves are all, again, computer preparation. We have queen to f3, bishop d6, and again, kind of goofy looking move, king f1, but a very strong move and computer prep. And then a very strong move from Magnus Carlsen, also computer prep, rook fb8. And then we have this exchange, bishop d2, c5, knight back to f3, rook d8, no comments because it's all just the engine playing basically. And then we have knight c3, and then finally the first move that Magnus Carlsen made on his own seems to be this one, this move knight to b4. So here we can stop and kind of assess the position. Black has a lot of compensation for the pawn. Black has the two bishops that are slicing and dicing and a lot of potential compensation. However, white is up a pawn, and he could have he had some chances in this game. Like he had some chances to consolidate his pawn a little bit cleaner, but he failed. He failed to consolidate that material. He ended up giving Magnus Carlsen more than enough counterplay. Magnus Carlsen ended up getting a draw, and that's kind of what led to Nepomniachtchi searching out some other anti-Marshal system where he felt like he had more in the position, and that leads us to this move pawn to a4 instead of pawn to h3. So here we have this move pawn to a4. Now, keep in mind, this really used to be a very reliable kind of anti-Marshal system. So one example is if we go back to like some Garry Kasparov games. In this game, Garry Kasparov versus Peter Leko played back in 2001. Continued bishop to b7, pawn to d3, d6, knight on b to d2, and then here, back then. A lot of people would play this move knight to a5, super common move. Knight a5, bishop to a2, c5, knight f1, rook e8, knight e3, h6. And, Kasparov, he's managed to get kind of like a normal Ruy Lopez-like position, but he didn't have to play h3 in the process. And this allowed him to get kind of a big advantage down the road. Like he plays bishop to d2, pawn to c4, bishop to c3, queen b6, knight d2, knight to c6, knight d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, we have knight a5, bishop a5, just to show you kind of what white was doing in these games, dc4, and then we have queen takes a4, which allows, Kasparov to do some stuff, pawn to c5, queen to b4, knight to e4, queen takes b2, takes on d6, bishop to f8, pawn to c3, and I guess that queen's in some trouble. Pawn to f5, pawn to d7, and then we have all these moves, and I'm just going to blitz through this because this isn't like the main focus of the video, just to see how brilliant Garry Kasparov is at winning games. But anyway, so king f6, bishop d5, and this is winning, obviously, for White. White's. So this was Kasparov versus Peter Leko, played back in Linares in 2001. But needless to say, the long and short of all this is White was getting enough, right? White was getting enough out of these positions and was getting enough play. The main part of the theory that you kind of have to remember is, White was getting that knight to e3. He wasn't having to play a pawn to h3. So what was going on with this? We go back to this a4 move. What was going on in this World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi that was making this very difficult for White to do? What is Black doing differently in these modern games that are changing things? Well, for starters, after a4, Magnus Carlsen started introducing some really interesting stuff. His main idea was basically just to play, eventually, pawn to d5. He wants to play in the style of the Marshal Gambit, no matter what the position is. So he had one game that followed down, of course, this main path. He just went straight down the main path, but he played it quite a bit differently. After bishop to b7, d3, d6, he played knight on b to d2, and now here we have this move from Black. Instead of knight a5, we have rook e8, because Magnus Carlsen is trying to actually play d5 at some point, and that becomes clear a little bit later. So after knight f1, we have h6, we have bishop to d2, bishop f8. So a lot of what White's doing looks very similar to what Kasparov did against Peter Leko all the way back in this 2001 game in Linares. But here's the big difference: is Magnus Carlsen intends knight e7, and then at least according to the engine, White's next move, played by Ian Nepomniachtchi, was the computer best pick. It was this move pawn to c4. I would have liked to see maybe g4 in at least one of the games. Would have been super interesting. But Nepomniachtchi wasn't brave enough to play it against Magnus. And one of the things that Magnus was doing, like I said, in a lot of these games, was he was setting up his pieces in such a way to reinforce a push of d5. So I think Carlsen was just Nepomniachtchi was just trying basically to do something to kind of stop this, to try to stop this d5 stuff. But Magnus was just so good at maneuvering his pieces in just the absolute correct way. After c4, b captures c4, and then knight captures c4, he would bring his knight back to c6, and then rook c1, a5, bishop d3, and just somehow White didn't get enough in this position. We have takes here, and then all this stuff, and then everything got exchanged, and then somehow this ended in a completely equal position after all the dust had settled. And this was somehow just completely equal, and White just didn't have enough to win. But that, even with that, it's okay, at least, Carlsen didn't just play in the style of the Marshal with pawn to d5. At least we prevented that. But then here's the move that really kind of bugs me. It's just not this classical path beginning with bishop b7. Black started playing rook b8. And here was the idea. This was kind of Carlsen's insane kind of idea. Was rook b8, a captures b5, a captures b5, and then we had this move from Nepomniachtchi, h3, and then we had this move d6. So again, we see d6. But what Magnus is waiting for is c3, because once c3 gets played, the Marshal idea is game on again with d6 to d5. So he actually does two-step it. First he plays b4, then after d3 he exchanges on c3, and then plays d5. It's just if this idea works against the a4 system, if just a4, rook b8, if we can just play chess like this, and then two-step with d6, wait for c3, and then play d5, it really puts into question almost all of the anti-Marshal systems with White. Because if Black can just respond to all of the anti-Marshal systems with kind of a timely d5, there is that other, Nepomniachtchi game that I just showed where Carlsen never quite got in d5, but then that still leaves, how do we meet rook b8? We can meet bishop b7, but how do we meet rook b8 if they can just do this? Because even here, it's not clear how we meet this, because if we play e takes d5, knight d5, knight e5, knight e5, rook e5, bishop e6, Black has tons of compensation for this material. He's got, attacks on c3, attacks on the e6 square. For instance, takes, d4, bishop f6, rook e1. They could play rook a8. And of course, this is really a scary amount of compensation for just one pawn. So how do we, this is the challenge, with playing a move like a4. How do we meet stuff like this? Especially at the highest levels right now. how are we handling this? I mean, obviously we don't have to play h3, maybe we can play c3, but then we have to deal with d5 immediately. And there's actually a game, Magnus has done this before as well. I mean, there's this game Duda versus Magnus that continued e5, knight takes d5, knight takes e5, transposes to a game that Magnus Carlsen actually played against Duda, where Magnus had the black pieces. So when you have players that are willing to do this, basically just go into a type of Marshall-esque type position, and it's pretty clear that they have probably enough compensation for the pawn, it makes you start to wonder, what type of anti-Marshall systems do we need to play, and how do we need to play them to continue to, at the very least, just get some sort of slight edge with white where we can continue to play chess. So I think, a4, I mean, it should still be a good system somehow. I just think that we need to find some new ideas. Otherwise, I mean, going back to the ambidextrous system with h3 or going, pawn to d4, I think the way the theory currently stands is probably the way to go. Keep in mind, none of these systems are particularly bad. I mean, in all of these cases, white is at least equal. In none of these cases is white worse. And certainly at, the regular levels, everything should still be fine. But at the highest levels, I still think, we have to struggle and try to figure out how to meet this idea of rook b8, followed by even just two-stepping the pawn to d6 and then pawn to d5, just to basically equalize with black by trying to get into this Marshall-type position anyway, where we just basically declare that we have enough compensation for the material. So that's kind of where the theory stands on pawn to a4 as kind of one of the anti-Marshall systems. It's still a very reasonable system to play at the lowest levels right now. The way the theory stands at the highest levels is it's very difficult to get anything out of it with the white pieces. So I'm kind of leaning towards other systems, like leaning towards either the ambidextrous system or leaning towards even pawn to d4 instead of pawn to a4 to try to get that advantage with the white pieces. Well, anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can incorporate some of these ideas into your own games. Thank you very much for watching.